folks, why don't we begin? My name is Marc Schneiberg, along with Joyce Rothschild. We were the two Network A or co-organizers that took on the job of organizing these virtual sessions. We're very excited to have you all here today. It looks like we're going to have a nice, small, intimate gathering, which I think is has its serious advantages. So let me first introduce Louise Colling, whose original title was Normative Control as a Lever. Let me say a minute about the theme. The theme is about governance, democratic governance, collective governance, and the different ways of organizing or not participation and decentralization within organizations. So this is mostly a panel about internal governance and internal organization of different forms, and but folks are free to move around that topic as well. Thank you all for coming, and Louise, I hand over the baton, the microphone to you. Welcome.
Thank you, Marc, for the introduction. I'm going to share my screen first. Okay, and now I'm going to share full screen. Is that all good? Yeah. Perfect. Okay. So thank you very much for this tremendous opportunity to share on my work, and also thanks for all the organizing efforts. To start on a joking note, after 8 years of management consulting, I'm now in the second year of my thesis, the end of the second year, and I was told recently by a colleague that it's the year of depression in a PhD process because there are a lot of changes, refocus, etc. Much can be said on that topic. That's not the purpose of my speech, but I want you to understand that I'm at this tricky step. And I have recently worked hard in the last week to refine my scope, re-articulate it. This is why you will find maybe some differences. No, you will find differences with the articles I've sent you. So I've clearly linked my research to critical labor studies and psychodynamic approaches. Don't be surprised. And I'm really happy to use actually this conference as a platform to test actually the building blocks of this research. So this is working perfect. The context, so the focus was initially on humanist organization, but I've been asked by my committee to refocus on collaborative work and holacracy. I guess most of you know what it entails. So distributed knowledge and social networks, combining collectivism and also individualism, mostly with management circles, reporting between circles, etc. These organizations have been on the rise since a lot of years, but it's been a boom with the flexibility wave gained in COVID. Also the growing base of millennial in the employee base and their expectations on collaboration and flexibility. And also, it's not on the slide, but these organizations have been also linked to better responses to environmental challenges. While these organizations are on the rise, there have been a lot of criticism in the literature about this organization in critical labor studies, mostly denouncing the promised freedom, emancipation with less control, while at the background maintaining normative pressure and alienating people at the end more than bureaucracies, actually, with 4 major mechanisms. So identity management, which has been researched since a long time, surveillance linked to tech, spirituality, mindfulness, and the mechanism I'm mostly interested in, wholeness. That's a more recent trend brought mostly by Resch in 2021, where actually you can exert some normative control or affective control through the psychological sense of community, through people's desire actually to belong, togetherness. So this is for the context. On the theoretical background, so I'm using here the popular concept of post-heroic leadership to highlight the evolutions in normative control, but also in on the alienation versus emancipation debate. So post-heroic leadership proceeds from humanistic management, where actually the leader steps down, leaving an empty symbolic authority. Well, this is on the surface, but at the background, it will give birth to collective fantasies of harmony, self-management, and it's still very much linked to the leader, enhanced by the leader, in the form of what is called by Picard and Islam neo-normative control, creating a double form of alienation where you have people submitting themselves to the fantasies while they think they are free. And recently, what I found really interesting in the literature on critical management studies is that the debate has evolved much more, where you had previously alienation versus emancipation. Now they are considered as interlinked in what is called paradoxical tension. So both are actually part of the same phenomenon and can't be in opposition. And this is what we can find in on the literature of collaborative work, where actually the authority here emanates from a symbolic authority called the communal other, that will actually concentrate all the fantasies for togetherness, and control will then turn into a more emotional affective control, where members will accept to submit themselves to emotional ups and downs to fully live the community experience and contribute to it, and leading to this paradoxical tension where you have alienation and emancipation that are both interlinked and needed. So knowing that collaborative control is raising, that affective control is embedded in collaborative work, that this communal other hasn't been much researched, and that the debate on emancipation alienation is evolving into paradoxical tensions, I've decided to refocus my PhD on this question, which is how could normative control or affective control here in collaborative work contribute to individual emancipation. And I would like to develop a fine-grained understanding of the mechanisms, the tipping points, namely in 3 questions. So this is a thesis with articles. So I will have 3 articles with 3 subjects. The first one is already done, gaining a holistic view on normative control. I won't go back on that. But now I sit at the second one, understanding how we can truly move from a symbolic authority from the leaders to a communal other authority. And to me, this is the first condition of emancipation, where we avoid the case of post-heroic leadership, where the leader is still managing at the background to engineer the culture, the fantasies, to have a better control of the organization at the end through neo-normative control. So how do you build this communal order? How do you transition towards it? And the second question, once we have built this communal order, how do we make sure that this collective source of authorities is balanced with, well, the desires of the self, the individual needs, so it enables enough emancipation? So to answer the second and the third question, I will do I'm already doing a multiple case study. You already know that that's part of the methodology in the article. So just for you to remember, a multiple case study, one organization is a nonprofit, the other a limited liability company. They're both using collaborative governance with principles coming mostly from holacracy. And from now, I've only conducted 10 exploratory interviews, but they've been really rich, and I plan to have more and to also have observation phases, obviously. I would like to share more, obviously, on some preliminary findings, knowing that it's the very beginning, of course. First, on the question about how to transition towards a communal other, I've noticed 2 levers and 2 obstacles, and you will find findings that were already part of my articles but framed differently here. So obviously one of the first lever, this is more a confirmation of previous studies, in example Ushi, a transcendental mission like a social mission, really reinforces the legitimacy or the construction of an upper source form of authority. So in organization A is the social mission, helping homeless people, and in organization B, it's the political project. So they are very attached to through their way of organizing to raise the citizen awareness of members. Another observation, another lever is what I've called, what they've called chosen alienation. So several members of the organizations posit that they do not believe anymore in liberated companies and post-heroic leadership where there is total individual freedom, that it should rather be bounded by democracy. So they chose the term themselves to chosen alienation. So where I, as part of the collective, will choose the rules to which I later submit myself. Then part of the obstacles, one interesting finding, I think, is the first one. There is a tendency in the literature, especially in Gates with the liberated enterprises, to convey that the leaders should step down, but still be the guardian of the culture, of the values. And actually what I see in this organization where they still have the leader as the guardian of the culture, it continues to fill the image of the leader as a symbolic authority, source of collective fantasies that could lead to more normative control. And creating a collective form of authority. And lastly, last obstacle, the culture of positive feedback. So in both organizations, there are processes, mechanisms to deal with inappropriate behaviors, but individuals really count on the founder to activate them because there is no culture of negative or at least constructive feedback. So in example, 2
Louise,
minutes.
5 minutes.
Oh, okay, I'm fine then. So in organization B, in example, 100% of disciplinary processes are initiated by the founder upon staff request. So I found it was also an interesting finding. At the moment, these are the two levers and obstacles I found in the transition towards a communal other as a source of symbolic authority. And then on the other question, on the other question about how to enable more emancipation or reduce alienation in affective control. So I've observed in both organizations forms of alienation. Organization A, psychosocial risk mostly. Organization B, resistance with people exiting the organization. And just to mention, in the methodology, I plan to have exit interviews. So to discuss with people who have left the organization. So Resch identifies 3 mechanisms that I've used to frame my first findings. 3 mechanisms that will actually help to enhance emancipation or to mitigate alienation. First, emotional distance, so to clearly set a boundary between work and private life. Second, emotional autonomy. How can I really free myself from the approval of others on my work? And the last one, emotional closure. So deciding to share less on emotions, but also to receive less from others when I'm overwhelmed. So those 3 mechanisms reduce alienation in affective control. And as part of the findings, quite quickly, I found that, interestingly, emotional distance is valued by both organizations. It's unequally challenging because the social missions makes it more difficult. But actions are taken by the organization to mitigate the risks. What is interesting is that emotional autonomy is ignored, not to say undervalued. Actually, I see a risk because people are expected to elevate themselves while it could actually deteriorate their emotional autonomy. And the last point, emotional closure is not ignored, it's actually denied. People are, there is a culture of extreme self-expression, like people expected to cry at work, for example, to show their emotions, etc., which can actually be really counterproductive in terms of emotional closure. So it's very preliminary at this stage, but I can already see where the organization succeeds and fails at enabling emancipation and the risks I see for alienation. Well, I'm conscious this is a bit different maybe from what you expected, but I hope you found it interesting. And thank you very much for the constructive feedback. And I'm really open to collaboration if you want. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That was both a model presentation and coming in at 13 minutes. I didn't even have to call the 2-minute sign. And let me just say, you're in the right place. I think the questions you're addressing fit perfectly with and contribute a great deal. So I don't think we find it quite, I think you're quite in line with some of the agendas here. Thank you. Let me move on now, and let me invite all the participants, as much as they feel comfortable, to activate their video. It's not required, but encouraged. So our next speaker, Nicos Moushouttas, organizational variety in decision-making in worker cooperatives. Let me get out of the way. Thank you for coming. You're on.
Thank you very much. And I think you got the surname right, 100%. Yeah, so just to say very quickly that I've just finished my PhD, and it was also a 3-paper format. And this is sort of a 4th one that I'm working on. So I have some data and findings that I wanted to discuss with regard. Yeah.
Nicos, you're sharing the presenter view. I don't know if you mean to do that.
Ah, okay. So is that still an issue?
Perfect. You're good.
Perfect. Yeah. So yeah, this is part of sort of a 4th paper that I hope to work on that has to do more with the democratic models of worker cooperatives. So I'm still liking quite a lot of the theory in a sense, and I'm trying to figure it out maybe also through discussions here. But so as to start, just to give a brief definition of worker cooperatives. I know many of you might know, it's just sometimes I get asked the questions about the difference between worker cooperatives and any other type of like cooperative organizations. So worker cooperatives are enterprises that are owned and controlled collectively by their respective workforce. By owned, it means that the productive labor is the sole appropriator and distributor of the surplus. By control, it means that they have control of the means of production and the productive process itself holistically. And collectively is that decisions over production appropriation are taken somewhat democratically, even though that doesn't necessarily mean a specific type of democratic model, as we will see in a bit. And yeah, I put that there just because it was some questions that I got in another conference. So they're not profit sharing companies. They're not codetermination companies like the German model. They're not consumer cooperatives. It's workers that holistically own and control the organization. With regards to the research motivation, it was to analyze the organizational realities and democratic process of worker cooperatives in general. Looking into what are the priorities and motivations of the worker members, what democratic models do they construct to take these decisions, and what is their potential for autonomy and worker empowerment in that case. And the research in general, the idea of this paper that I hope one day to write is that it tries to extend on the literature on collectivist democracy, which was introduced by Rothschild and Wheat, and horizontalism in organizations by incorporating, so taking into consideration the pressures to produce into the analysis, which is something that is often lacking when we talk about democratic organizing. We look at the model without the pressures that the organizations have to also maintain a certain level of operations. It also, in other words, realizes that certain democratic and organizational models might be more suitable in some worker cooperatives due to their operations. For example, they might need to apply a division of labor or a certain form of hierarchy through managerial control. Additionally, it aims to critique the inevitability of degeneration and then relatively dogmatic degeneration thesis by illustrating how the combination of economic pressures alongside co-ownership and cooperation allows for the creation of a multiplicity of democratic models. In other words, and this was something that one of the participants was saying, is that there needs to be an understanding there is no holy grail in democratic organizing, and that worker members adapt their organizational structure to maintain a level of operational performance, but at the same time maintain a sense of collective control. So the data is collected primarily through interviews and direct observations of 5 worker cooperatives. That was the data collected for the whole thesis. But for this particular presentation, I'm mostly focusing on the data gathered from 3 small worker cooperatives. The reason for that is that I basically wanted to eliminate size as a variable in order to talk more specifically about once we eliminate size, that there can still be multiplicity in how people organize themselves. So I'm going to go through very briefly. I'm going to go through very briefly of the organizational outline of the 3 organizations that I'll talk about before going into some of the similarities that I found that can contribute to fundamental aspects of democratic organizing in worker co-ops. So the first one was a small bicycle shop. Most of the operations were semi-technical, which means that many of the people that worked there could learn how to do the job on the shop floor, didn't need to have prior expertise. Its government system was completely flat, completely decentralized with no managerial roles. Basically, people were meeting on the shop floor, taking decisions about daily tasks, and then meeting once a month to take broader decisions about the rota, about the budget requests, and address operational matters. The second one, the software development agency, which was of similar size, still 11 to 12 worker members, had a completely still decentralized, but more formalized and completely different organizational structure, which was along the lines of sociocracy, which is certain principles about self-government to smaller teams and consent decision-making. So in this case, members could join different circles. They could join as many circles as they wanted, with the only exception that they had to be part of the member circle. And the member circle was where they would decide which domains and what powers each other circle had. And information was basically shared from mouth to mouth within those circles. In this case, they only had managerial roles when they were facing a client, because they were a software industry, software development agency. They had clients that were used to speaking to a project manager, and therefore they did have installed a project manager, but decisions about the project were taken democratically after discussion with the client was taking place. And finally, the third one, which was completely different in its structure, was a high-tech manufacturing firm. This one was made of 30 people by the time I got there. And it was, again, majority very highly technical task. It includes software engineers, software developers, physicists, mechanical engineers, electrical engineers, people that basically had a lot of experience in what they were doing before even joining the company, did a lot of search. And this was a much more centralized model. So they had permanent managerial roles, and they would elect a committee to take decisions about how they would go about. So the first thing that we could conclude with regards to that is that there is a huge variety when it comes to democratic organizing. And it's something that I want to emphasize as well as going forward. And all of these companies were very successful at the time where I went there in terms of keeping their operational performance. And going to the next slide, I wanted to speak about some of the similarities of the fundamental aspect these companies that these working members held close to heart and wanted to exercise and practice in their organization. So on one hand, they all spoke and they all wanted autonomy in the workplace. And I found this interesting because the definition that I had of autonomy was completely different, and the definitions that they gave me of autonomy was quite varied. So even though autonomy was holding similar weight, and even though the majority of them said they joined the worker co-op because of having more autonomous status as workers, the conception was varying based on the priorities and motivations of the worker members. So in one hand, and especially about the manufacturing company, autonomy was just the ability to control the rhythm and manner of one's work. With regards to the second one, it was also about self-government, not just the ability to control the rhythm of the work, but the ability to choose when you want to take decisions about time, when to opt in and when to opt out. And everyone was encouraged to do that. And the third one, in the third case, like adding an extra layer, it was an act of defiance to hierarchy and centralized form of authority. They, especially in the bicycle shop, was the belief that autonomy was a stance that you would take, not only because you want operational freedom, but because it's against, it is actively against hierarchy. And that was one of the quotes that one of the people there said, that we're trying to practice values of autonomy and working alongside people which can give you a chance to build more meaningful social bonds, which people you work with in everyday life. It was a huge part of being a worker co-op member. The second feature, which seemed fundamental, was consent in decision-making. And I'm saying consent here instead of consensus, which I found quite interesting because a lot of the literature speaks about consensus. So consent is decisions are taken once no one affected critically opposes them. It is often conceptualized as the difference between preference and the range of tolerance. So the idea that you will not get exactly what you want, but you will need to extend the range of what you can tolerate with regards to a specific decision. And it seemed to be an ongoing process on the shop floor, influencing and being influenced by the relations that the working members built as co-workers and co-owners. But an ongoing process as well of trying to reach unity in decision-making through acceptance rather than through necessary agreement. And this was...
Nicos, I'm sorry, you're at 5 minutes.
5 minutes. And I'll skip some of the quotes then. Finally, and perhaps more surprisingly, because I didn't expect that going into the research, was the formalization. So formalization in many occasions facilitated and enhanced autonomy and democratic decision-making. Even though the degree and form of formalization would differ from co-op to co-op, the rules were created to accommodate their own priorities and goals. Worker members did not, in many occasions, feel that they just followed rules, but followed the rules that they created while having their values and priorities in mind. This was allowed because of their unique role as both rule creators and rule followers. And one of the big examples of that, and I think I might have some time for that, is that in one of the worker co-ops, for example, they didn't even want to have equal pay because they considered that equal pay is still unfair pay, as people have different needs and outside work. And they decided that they wanted to discuss the amount of pay they would get. And although even that decision required a lot of strong social bonds, they were aware that they wouldn't be able to have those talks unless they broke them down into bite-sized chunks in discussion, into a standardized sort of process that would allow everyone to speak and everyone to share opinions without getting too personal, knowing that this is a highly sensitive matter. So just some general conclusions with regards to this. With regards to the autonomy, in all cases, it entails a recognition that working members are able to construct their own rules and norms to manage their work and govern their relations in the workplace. And it is built upon relations of mutual trust, cooperation. Autonomy was not individualistic, but collective, as working members were expected to act in ways that did not compromise, but rather promoted the common values that they were creating. Decision-making was constructed to allow for diversity of opinions and compromise. That's not something new, that's something that has been observed. However, members tried to find unity in decision-making through acceptance rather than agreement. So it was even discussed as if we haven't necessarily agreed, but we will accept this and proceed. These relied on the understanding that individual preferences are not above collective ones. And as rule creators, worker members create processes that reflect and facilitate their values and priorities. And as rule followers, they can follow those processes, allowing for a structured way of discussing, deliberating, and deciding, which gives equal opportunity to all and minimizes interpersonal grievances and informal hierarchies. In addition, by recognizing and monitoring this process, the worker members can understand where they can be improved as such and reevaluate and adapt them in a meaningful way to them. And just as some final reflections, is that formalizing processes should be reconsidered in the literature of democratic organizing more broadly and worker cooperatives more specifically. I know that any type of formalization quite often is considered as a restrictive or bureaucratic control, but it seems that in many occasions, once the rule followers make also the rules, it can in some occasions help. The other point is that the apparent organizational variety and the common strive for improving the decision-making process to satisfy the operational demands and values of the cooperative members suggests not only the flexibility of democratic models, but also the adaptability of worker-controlled organizations. And the last point is that co-ownership seems to be an essential part of this. Without the equal status of worker members as rule creators, this process cannot be applied in the same way and have the same effects, which is perhaps a bit of a critique of democratic organizing in also non-collectively owned organizations or capitalist enterprises, that maybe we cannot reach that level because at the end of the day, there is no that equal status. So we're speaking about a completely different type of dynamics that are generated. Yeah, and as such, the final argument that I'm trying to make is that it seems that democratic organizing can fully develop and innovate in work and owned and controlled organizations. But yeah, I think that was the final slide.
That was great. Thank you. I didn't give you the 2-minute mark because I judged perhaps randomly but correctly that you were wrapping up. So nicely done. Thank you so much. I think again, and I think I have to attribute to Joyce the coherence, the high level of coherence we have, my co-organizer so far. Thank you. We move on to our third presenter, Trevor Young-Hyman, Following the Right Process: How Constitutional Systems Enable Legitimate Centralization in Decentralized Organization, which might resonate nicely with the formalization point here. I'll stop editing. Trevor, please.
Yeah, hi everyone. All right, so let me start this. Yeah, so this is great. Thank you, Marc, Jason, for organizing this, Joyce for organizing it. Such a coherent group of topics, and already I've heard things in the previous presentations that really resonate with what I'm going to present today. Let's see here. Hide this video panel. So the paper is called Constitutional Systems of Authority, and it's with Mike Lee from INSEAD. And I think that so I presented this paper in London like a few weeks ago, and so this picture was more relevant. But this is a picture of the signing of the Magna Carta. And what's remarkable about the signing of the Magna Carta was that this was like the creation of a democratic government, right? But what happened with the signing of the Magna Carta was not that they got rid of hierarchy. It's actually that they just constrained hierarchy. And so that's kind of the idea of the paper, is that in decentralized organizations, there is a role for hierarchy. But actually, in order to maintain the legitimacy of the broader decentralized authority structure, you need to constrain that hierarchy in certain ways. So that's where I'm going with this. And so, as you all know, there's a lot of interest in different forms of decentralized organizing, forms of authority where formal authority is widely distributed. And this comes from different places. I think a lot of the folks in this room are particularly interested in issues around inequality and work experience, so the psychological elements of decentralized organizing, but also people interested in knowledge production and decentralized organizing brought on by technology, kind of a range of interests in this. But the one thing that was a puzzle to Mike and I is that sometimes decentralized organizations need to centralize, right? There are certain moments in organizational lives when decisions need to be made urgently, such as in times of crisis, or when there is some element of conflict, or to restore organizational control, or to initiate organization-wide strategic shifts. And these moments when there is some need for centralization or a smaller subset of actors making decisions, these can be challenging for these organizations. The risk of temporary centralization in decentralized organizations is that they can be a threat to the internal legitimacy of the organization. What do I mean by that? It's the degree to which workers perceive the power structure to be in accord with the norms, values, beliefs, practices, and procedures of the organization. Right. So why does bureaucracy work? Why do internal authority structures work? Because people accept them as legitimate. You're not constantly thinking, does my boss have the right to tell me what to do? No, I take it for granted that if my boss tells me what to do, I'm going to do it. Why? Because I accept the norms, values, sort of the underlying rationale of this authority structure. And delegitimized authority, when people start to question those norms, values, is this organization really committed to these values, right? Can lead decentralized organizations to decay, to fall apart, to shift towards more hierarchy. And so Oliver Williamson talked about the impossibility of selective intervention when there's not a credible commitment to decentralization, that people in leadership positions may sort of intervene, unpredictably intervene. Not only that, but as DiMaggio and Powell have told us and other institutionalists, we operate in this broader environment of bureaucratic hierarchy as the institutionalized norm. So there's always this temptation to shift towards more hierarchical bureaucratic decision making. And then there have been a number of studies that have shown the abandonment of decentralization in many of these organizations. And there's also this broad impression of sort of the fragility of decentralized organizing. That this is a fragile, costly to maintain form. And note how these issues don't quite apply to centralized organizing, bureaucratic hierarchy, because of the fact that they are the norm. Because of the fact that authority can be temporarily delegated downward and then brought back upward. And this doesn't lead to a questioning of the broader norms of hierarchical organizing, right? So the question we wanted to answer is, how can decentralized organizations temporarily centralize without losing internal legitimacy? Okay, that was sort of the broader focus of this. And I just wanted to, let's see, I am not, where's the video panel? There it is. I can see everyone. Okay, good. So I can see whether your faces are like, what the heck are you talking about? Okay, so how did we go about looking at this? So we wanted to look at decentralized organizations during a moment in which they would face pressure to centralize. And what do they do? That's what we wanted to understand. So we started off with about 25 decentralized organizations, all stripes and colors, different forms of decentralization. I'll show you in a second. And we started doing interviews. We interviewed about 25 of these organizations across the US, some in Europe, all about how they navigated COVID, because crisis is a moment when organizations tend to centralize authority. There's this idea of the threat rigidity thesis, in which organizations retract control. Okay, so what do? Well, what we were surprised, I think, we didn't go into this expecting that we would see that all these organizations would centralize. We actually thought that some of them would resist centralization. Almost universally, they centralized. They pulled in the reins, and a subset of people took control. And so that was interesting to us. But then the question became, well, how do they do this without undermining the values of the organization? And so from these larger set, as we were going back through these interviews and these transcripts, these particular cases, right, stuck out to us as these particularly rich accounts of the ways that these organizations navigated the crisis. We ended up focusing on these particular four. They are different types of decentralization. So the first one is holacracy with employee ownership. The second one is a worker cooperative. The third one is holacracy without employee ownership. The fourth one is a tech company that had this, there's a lack of distributed ownership, a lack of formal governance, distributed governance, but a lot of their decision structures like HR functions were performed by volunteer committees. And they had a lot of informal norms of sort of anyone can walk into any meeting, we do financial transparency. So it was a much more informal version. They're all in kind of knowledge intensive spaces. And so what do? In each of the cases, we did 8 to 14 interviews across types, people, right, occupations, and then we ran a survey in each of the companies. And most importantly, we asked them the degree to which they perceived that the organization's navigation of the crisis was consistent with the governance principles of the organization. Did they navigate COVID in that consistent way? Okay. I know this is a long wind up for a short swing. So first of all, they all centralized, okay? But what was remarkable was the difference in perceptions of legitimacy. So in enterprise, for example, he said, I feel like this crisis in so many, it allowed us to test the things we say matter, right? So when values are tested, I think this, provides some sort of confidence that they actually work. While in plant, it's like this tinge of sadness. Plant was so unique. It was so different. And I feel like we lose that. Something happened during the crisis that led us to lose that. And we saw this similar variation in this survey. So while at Enterprise, Energy, and Evolve, they maintained between 93 and 85% of the workers perceived that the organization's management of the crisis was consistent with their values. Plant was the clear outlier. So then the question for us that I will sort of share with you, I discovered in the last 5 minutes, is how do they go about doing this? So what do we see in the qualitative data that explain this variation? Sort of traditional grounded theory approach, centralization events were a unit of analysis, we're coding around these centralization. And what I mean by that is the specific areas of authority that were centralized. That was really our conceptual unit of analysis. Within these organizations, different dimensions of authority were centralized. We focused there. And here's what we ended up, finding from this analysis. One, Nicos was just talking about rules. Rules seem to matter a lot. What we call a constitutional system of authority. And second, leadership behavior. Coincidentally, what Louise was talking about, to some degree. That these two dimensions were core to people perceiving legitimacy was preserved. Okay, so what are constitutional systems of authority? So
You're at 5.
Yep, thanks, Marc. In the 3 high legitimacy cases, the organizations had rule systems for centralizing authority. These were documents, the decision zone chart or the Constitution, that provided the workers a guide for how to shift authority at different points in time. And as we started to look at these documents and the ways that they went about utilizing them, we saw a lot of similarity to Ostrom's model of governance of common pool resources. So what we argue in these documents, there are 3 components. And in the paper, and I'm happy to share the paper with you, we provide a lot of evidence of the utilization of these different rule levels. So there are operational rules that define the participants and potential actions. So this CEO or this leader wouldn't normally do this, but in a moment of crisis, they have the authority to do this. Collective choice rules about how to shift authority. If the CEO or the executive wants to take more power, here's the process. And then finally, rules about changing rules. if you are unhappy with this decision structure, here's the mechanism for doing that. And when we interviewed people about their experience with this, they talked about referencing these rule systems. So, for example, when this Evolve worker was talking about the creation of a new centralized role, they said the new role of cost cutter had more centralized authority, but it was the same process to put that role in place as putting any role in place. It was a familiar process. And even though the conversation is hard, centralization doesn't feel good in this decentralized organization, there's a process to it, right? We're like comfortable with that process. We are familiar with it, and there are oversight mechanisms. Conversely, in the case of the firm where there were not these explicit rules, people felt like the ship was kind of sailing. What I worry about is that people are going to think so centralization was happening, but they didn't exactly know the process for centralization. They didn't know who the authority was centralizing to. They didn't know sort of the boundaries of it. I worry that people are going to think that this is some secret society the only elite can join, and the decisions are going to get made and they're going to come down as commandments on high. And that's not actually what's happening. But there was this sort of decay. So not only did the rules give justification for centralizing authority, but they allowed members to resist centralization, to set the boundaries of centralization. So here's a case in which leadership is saying, we're going to centralize decision-making about how you manage Zoom calls. And the workers can say, okay, you can do that, but the rules tell us that we get authority in navigating our internal roles, how we do the details of the work that we're doing, okay? And so they sort of says, okay, I can set the boundary on this. Conversely, in the case where there weren't these formal rules, workers started to abdicate even more authority than the leaders wanted them to. So
2 minutes.
Yeah, thank you. So in the case where there were no formal rules, sort of the leadership took control, people took more authority, and then workers just started asking for approval on decisions that they didn't need to ask for approval on. So it's because it was like there was this new power, we're not exactly sure who's in control here, and this person says there's something about human nature and a hierarchy that they feel like that's the way it should be, or the way it is, just because we have this leadership team who's taking control. So a lack of boundaries just sort of led to this abdication of authority. That's the big sort of finding in this, is the importance of these rule structures for doing this. We also have some stuff in the paper about the role of leadership as well, which I'll skip through because of time. But the leader behavior sort of is like the cushions around the rule structure, sort of the communication of the rules, and seems to sort of reinforce this. And so what we ultimately do is we try to explain this variation in the degree of legitimacy based on the presence of these different components. And we think it does a pretty good job of explaining this variation. So just to wrap up in 30 seconds, one, we think that this offers a theorization of more durable decentralization, decentralization that can flex, right? Second of all, we think that it would be useful to reconceptualize decentralization not only as the distribution of task authority, but also the distribution of rule authority, making rules, changing rules, and that this is an important component of theorizing decentralized structure. I'll stop right there. I've used all of my time, but thanks everyone.
Trevor, that was great. Thank you so much.